The Volunteer, the untold story of Witold Pilecki, the man who entered hell to tell the world. The cell was cold, not the biting cold of Auschwitz winters that Witold Pilecki had endured for 946 days, but the damp, institutional cold of Mokotów prison in Warsaw. It was May 25th, 1948. The hour approached 9:30 in the evening. Pilecki sat on the edge of a narrow cot, his hands steady despite everything. Outside his cell, footsteps echoed through the corridor, measured, purposeful, coming closer. He had survived Nazis, survived Auschwitz, survived the Warsaw Uprising, but he would not survive this night. Not in communist Poland, not under the regime that had branded him a traitor to the very nation he had given everything to protect. Father Wincenty Martuszewicz entered first, a military chaplain whose presence offered what little mercy this moment would allow. Then came the others: Deputy Prosecutor, Major Ciprzewski, Prison Head Lieutenant Monko, and Dr. Lieutenant Jezierski. Their faces betrayed nothing. They had done this before. Pilecki rose to his feet. At 47 years old, he stood with the same quiet dignity that had defined him through torture, through show trials, through the systematic dismantling of everything he had fought for. He had written appeals for clemency that went unanswered. President Boleslav Bierut had pardoned others sentenced alongside him, but not Pilecki. Never Pilecki. His crime was too great. He had dared to resist tyranny twice. They led him down the corridor. Each step echoed in the silence. Somewhere in the city beyond these walls, his wife Maria waited, still believing he had been deported east to Siberia. Somewhere, his children, Andrei and Zofia, moved through a world that would soon brand them as children of an enemy of the state. They would be denied education, denied work, denied the very future their father had fought to secure. The execution wall loomed ahead. Pilecki turned to face it, and in that final moment, perhaps his mind traveled back through the years, back through the battles, back to the decision that would define him forever, back to the day he volunteered to enter Auschwitz. Chapter 1. A boy born in exile. To understand the man who would volunteer for hell, you must first understand the world that forged him. May 13, 1901. Olonets, Karelia, a small town in the frozen reaches of the Russian Empire. So far north it seemed the world had forgotten it existed. Witold Pilecki was born here, but this was not his homeland. No Pilecki had ever chosen to live in this bitter exile. They were here because of rebellion, because of resistance, because 63 years earlier, in 1863, Poland had risen against the Russian Empire in what history would call the January Uprising. Witold's grandfather, Józef Pilecki, had fought in that uprising. He had taken up arms against the Tsar, demanding freedom for a nation that had been erased from maps, carved up between three empires like meat at a feast. When the uprising failed, as doomed rebellions often do, the punishment was swift and merciless. Józef was exiled to Siberia for 7 years. His estate near Novogrudek was confiscated. His family's nobility, their lands, their very identity, was stripped away. After his release, Józef was not permitted to return home. He was resettled in Olonets, in the frozen north, as far from Poland as the Tsar could send him without shipping him to the Arctic. There, in that place of exile, the Pilecki family rebuilt what they could. Witold's father, Julian, grew up in this exile, but he refused to let the cold north freeze his Polish heart. He studied forestry in St. Petersburg, rising to become a forest inspector in Olonets. He married Ludwika Osieczymska, whose own family had paid the price of resistance. Her brothers, Hippolyte and Hieronym, had fought in the January Uprising and fled to France to escape execution. Witold was one of 5 children born to Julian and Ludwika, surrounded by siblings Maria, Wanda, Jerzy, and little Józef, who would die at only 5 years old. But it was his mother, Ludwika, who planted the seeds of resistance in young Witold's heart. While Russian snow piled against their windows and Russian officials walked their streets, Ludwika told her children stories of Poland, stories of the uprising, stories of Mikhail Muravyov, the Russian general they called the Hangman, who had executed captured Polish rebels from gallows in Vilnius squares, turning patriotism into public spectacle, turning heroes into corpses swaying in the wind. She taught her children Polish language and Polish history, in a place where speaking of such things invited danger. She filled their minds with the names of Polish heroes, with poetry of Polish poets, with dreams of a nation that existed only in memory and hope. Young Witold absorbed these lessons like dry earth absorbs rain. He played soldier games in the forest, building castles in trees, staging battles where hussars defeated Cossacks, where Polish swords cut through enemy lines represented by nettles and yellow flowers. In 1910, when Witold was 9, Ludwika made a decision. Her children needed more than stories. They needed connection to the culture the Russians had tried to erase. She took Witold and his siblings to Vilnius, leaving Julian behind in Olonets where his work demanded he stay. Vilnius was still under Russian control, still occupied, but it was closer to Poland. It was a city where Polish culture survived in shadows and whispers. In Vilnius, Witold attended local schools, but his real education happened underground. At 12 years old, he joined the secret Polish Scouting and Guiding Association, the Związek Harcerstwa Polskiego, known as ZHP. This was not a social club for boys to learn knot tying and camping. This was training ground for future resistance fighters, a clandestine organization teaching Polish youth how to keep their nation's spirit alive under occupation. Then came 1914. World War I erupted across Europe, and the Russian Empire convulsed with violence. Vilnius became dangerous. Ludwika moved her children to her mother's estate in Havrilkov, in the Mogilev region, and Witold was sent further east to Oriol to stay with his aunt Maria Winicka, where he could continue his education safer from the front lines. But safety was not in young Witold Pilecki's nature. Even in Oriol, far from any battlefield, he organized. He formed a scout patrol. He gathered like-minded Polish youth, and in the spring of 1918, when he was just 17 years old, he took part in what might be called his first combat operation. Along with his fellow scouts, Witold broke into a Russian military warehouse. They stole uniforms, weapons, equipment. Their plan was to join the first Polish corps being formed under General Józef Dąbor-Musnicki, an army rising from the chaos of the Russian Revolution to fight for Polish independence. The raid went off without anyone being killed, though the warehouse guards opened fire at these audacious young thieves in the night. The Russian Empire was collapsing. Revolution was devouring it from within, and in that collapse, Poland saw its chance. On November 11, 1918, after 123 years of being erased from maps, Poland declared independence. The nation was reborn. Witold and his family returned to Vilnius in the summer of 1918. But independence on paper did not mean freedom on the ground. German troops still occupied the city, so Poles formed self-defense units, determined to force the occupiers out. Witold joined these units alongside his fellow scouts. They were teenagers playing at war, but they were deadly serious. On December 31, 1918, the Germans finally withdrew. Vilnius was free, for about 5 weeks. On January 5, 1919, Bolshevik forces seized the city. The Red Terror had arrived. Poland's independence was immediately challenged by Soviet Russia, which saw the newly reborn nation as a barrier to spreading communist revolution westward into Europe. What followed was the Polish-Soviet War, a conflict largely forgotten in Western history books, but absolutely critical to understanding the 20th century. If Poland had fallen, if the Red Army had pushed through to Germany, the entire future of Europe would have been different. Witold Pilecki was 18 years old when he went to war. He commanded a ZHP scout section, armed with captured weapons and burning patriotism. But they were no match for the hardened Bolshevik forces. His unit was overrun. Pilecki fell back, joined regular Polish army units, fought in guerrilla actions behind enemy lines, then retreated to Białystok, where he enlisted as a private in the newly forming national military. He fought in the Polish retreat from Kiev. He fought in the decisive Battle of Warsaw in August 1920, where Polish forces, outnumbered, outgunned, somehow turned back the Red Army tide that had seemed unstoppable. Historians would call it the miracle on the Vistula. Soldiers who were there simply called it survival. Pilecki fought in the forests at Rudniki. He took part in the liberation of Vilnius from Bolshevik control. On August 5, 1920, Witold Pilecki joined the 211th Ulan Regiment, a cavalry unit, accepting the rank that his combat experience had earned him. He was 19 years old and already a veteran of multiple wars. When the Polish-Soviet War finally ended in 1921 with the Treaty of Riga, Poland's independence was secured. For now, Pilecki was transferred to the reserves in 1921. He completed his secondary education while continuing officer training. In 1926, at age 25, he received something his family had not possessed in 3 generations: land. He became owner of the Sukoce estate in the Lida district, ancestral property that his grandfather had lost to confiscation after the January Uprising. It was a homecoming of sorts, a restoration of what rebellion had cost. Chapter 2. The Quiet Years. For the next decade, Witold Pilecki lived a life that seemed almost ordinary, almost peaceful. It was a deception, of course. Peace never lasts. But for a time, he allowed himself to believe in it. He managed the Sukoce estate, learning the rhythms of farming and forestry. He raised horses. He painted landscapes. He wrote poetry, verses about childhood memories, about the forests, about the simple beauty of dawn breaking over fields. His neighbor was General Edward Ridzschmigwy, and they hunted together in each other's woods, 2 soldiers pretending they could leave war behind. In 1929, while doing social work in a nearby village, Witold met a schoolteacher named Maria Ostrowska. She was from Ostrów Mazowiecka, educated, kind, with a quiet strength that matched his own. Witold was immediately smitten. He helped her prepare decorations for a school play. He began finding excuses to visit the estate where she was staying with friends. And then, in a gesture that friends would remember forever, he would ride his horse past her window and throw bouquets of flowers into her room. Whether they were elderflowers, jasmine, dahlias, or lilies of the valley, depends on who tells the story. But the romance was real. It took him 2 years to win her heart. On April 7, 1931, in the church at Ostrów Mazowiecka, Witold Pilecki married Maria Ostrowska. There was no wedding reception. Maria's father, Konstanty Ostrowski, had died just 3 months earlier, and grief made celebration feel wrong. The newlyweds returned to Sukoce after the ceremony and began building their life together. On January 16, 1932, their son Andrzej was born. A year later, daughter Zofia arrived. Witold threw himself into fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to everything. He taught his children about nature, showing them ladybugs and explaining they were part of God's creation. He taught them to be brave, to tell the truth, to admit mistakes. He did not tolerate lying. He wanted them to know how to face any situation life might throw at them. He made them stand straight at the table, building discipline into everyday life. His daughter Zofia would remember him showing them everything as if time was running out, as if he knew he would not have long with them. She remembered the gentleness in his calloused hands. She remembered him saying that courage was the most important virtue, that truth mattered more than comfort. Maria worked as a teacher in the nearby village of Krupa. After Zofia's birth, Maria's health deteriorated, and she spent time in a sanatorium. Witold cared for the young children with help from his elderly mother, Ludwika, though her age limited what she could do. He learned to change diapers and prepare meals, to soothe nightmares and answer endless questions. He was both father and mother during those months, and he never complained. He remained active in the reserves, completing regular training exercises with the 26th Greater Poland Ulan Regiment. In the summers, he attended military drills. He stayed sharp. Something in him, some instinct honed by too much early war, told him the peace would not last. He was right. In the summer of 1939, as Europe watched in growing horror, Nazi Germany turned its eyes toward Poland. Adolf Hitler demanded the return of Danzig and the Polish corridor. He spoke of Lebensraum, living space for the German people, which really meant conquest and extermination of those already living there. Britain and France promised to defend Poland if war came. But promises and defense are different things. On August 23, 1939, the world learned that Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia had signed a non-aggression pact. What most did not learn until later was the secret protocol in that pact. Germany and the Soviets had agreed to divide Poland between them. Again. Poland would be erased from the map. Again. Its people would be enslaved, murdered, scattered. Again. August 1939. Witold Pilecki received his mobilization orders. He kissed Maria goodbye. He embraced his children, 7-year-old Andrei and 6-year-old Zofia. He promised to return. He rode to join his cavalry regiment. War was coming, and Witold Pilecki was going to meet it. Chapter 3. Invasion and Defiance. September 1st, 1939, 4:45 a.m. German artillery opened fire on Polish positions. Nazi aircraft filled the skies. Tanks rolled across borders. The invasion of Poland had begun, and with it, the Second World War. Witold Pilecki fought with the 19th Infantry Division's cavalry squadron. Polish cavalry against German tanks is one of history's most misunderstood images. The Poles were not fools charging tanks with lances. They were skilled cavalry units performing reconnaissance, rearguard actions, and lightning raids. But they were facing the Wehrmacht, the most modern and terrifying military machine ever assembled to that point in history. The outcome was never in doubt. Poland fought for 35 days, outnumbered, outgunned, facing enemies from both west and east. When the Soviets invaded on September 17th, Polish forces conducted one of the most spirited defenses of the war. But spirit alone does not stop panzer divisions. On September 27th, Warsaw surrendered. By October 6th, the last Polish forces had been defeated. Pilecki's unit was shattered. Rather than surrender, he joined with other Polish stragglers and kept fighting guerrilla actions until the formal end of resistance. Then, like thousands of other Polish officers and soldiers, he faced a choice: flee to continue fighting elsewhere or go underground and resist from within occupied Poland. Pilecki chose resistance. In late October 1939, he made his way to Warsaw and disappeared into the underground. By November, he had joined forces with Major Jan Włodarkiewicz to co-found one of the earliest resistance organizations, Tajna Armia Polska, the secret Polish army, known as TAP. Pilecki became chief of staff, then head of its first branch, responsible for organization and mobilization. Within months, TAP had nearly 19,000 members spread across Warsaw, Podlasia, Kielce, and beyond. But operating underground was dangerous. The Gestapo and German security services infiltrated resistance groups. Informers were everywhere. Money could buy betrayal. Fear could compel it. In May 1940, an informer led to the arrest of 2 TAP leaders. The organization was compromised. Something had to be done. Something drastic. That spring, reports began filtering back to the resistance about a new German concentration camp being set up near the town of Auschwitz in southern Poland. The Germans called it Auschwitz. Little was known about it. Some TAP members had been arrested and sent there. Communications had ceased. What was happening inside those walls? Were the prisoners being used for labor? Were they being systematically killed? Could they be organized to resist? Could they be liberated? Major Włodarkiewicz proposed sending someone inside to gather intelligence and organize resistance from within. It was a suicide mission in everything but name. The likelihood of survival was minimal. The likelihood of maintaining sanity was even worse. Whoever went would need to be captured by the Germans, transported to Auschwitz, and somehow organize a network while surrounded by guards who killed prisoners for looking at them wrong. Witold Pilecki volunteered. His superiors stared at him. A married man with 2 young children was volunteering to be sent to a concentration camp. Pilecki explained his reasoning calmly. Many TAP members were already there. They needed leadership, needed organization, needed hope. Information had to be gathered. The Allies had to be informed about what the Germans were doing. And if possible, if enough prisoners could be organized, if, outside, forces could coordinate with them, Auschwitz could be liberated from within. It was insane. It was impossible. It was exactly the kind of mission that Witold Pilecki had been preparing for his entire life, though he had not known it until this moment. His plan was approved. They gave him false identity papers in the name of Tomasz Serafiński, a tanner from Nowy Wisnich. The real Serafiński had been a reserve officer who had left his documents behind in a Warsaw apartment, and Pilecki had found them while staying there. He changed the photograph, memorized the biographical details. He became someone else. On September 19, 1940, Witold Pilecki walked deliberately into a neighborhood where the Germans were conducting a łapanka, a street roundup. German security forces surrounded blocks of Warsaw, seizing random civilians to be sent to labor camps or concentration camps. It was a terror tactic designed to keep the Polish population compliant. Most people avoided these areas at all costs. Pilecki walked straight into one. Around 2,000 civilians were seized that day, packed into the Light Horse Guards barracks for processing. For 2 days, they suffered beatings with rubber batons, degradation, terror. Pilecki stayed silent, gave his false name, endured. On September 21st, the prisoners were loaded onto trucks. They drove all day without food or water, bodies pressed together, breathing each other's fear. Late at night on September 21st, 1940, the trucks arrived at Auschwitz. Prisoner number 4859 had arrived. Tomasz Serafiński had arrived. Witold Pilecki had arrived, and hell was about to meet the only man who ever volunteered to enter it. Chapter 4. The Gates of Hell. The trucks stopped. Searchlights blinded them. Dogs barked. Voices screamed in German. Incomprehensible fury and command mixed together. The prisoners were beaten out of the trucks with clubs, herded like cattle toward the gates. Men who moved too slowly were beaten harder. Men who fell were kicked until they rose or stopped moving. Random prisoners were pulled from the mass, shot in the head without explanation. Their bodies left where they fell as lessons to the others. The guards laughed. Pilecki moved through this gauntlet with his head down and his mind sharp. He was taking it all in, recording it. Every detail, every horror. This was what he came to witness, though witnessing it was worse than anything he had imagined. They passed under the iron gate. The words above it proclaimed, Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. It was a lie. Work here brought only suffering and death. Freedom was not the goal. Extermination was. They reached the parade ground where prisoners in blue and white striped uniforms waited for them. These were capos, prisoner functionaries who enforced discipline for the SS guards. Most were German criminals transferred from other prisons, men who had committed violent crimes in civilian life and found that Auschwitz gave them unlimited power to continue committing violence. They wore yellow armbands marking their authority. Their faces showed no mercy. The new prisoners were driven into the bathhouse. All clothing was confiscated. Heads were shaved. Bodies were shaved. They were sprayed with near-freezing water, in what the guards mockingly called showers. When Pilecki emerged, he was supposed to hold his prisoner number sign in his teeth, but he held it in his hand instead. A guard noticed. The guard clubbed him across the face. 2 of Pilecki's front teeth shattered. Blood filled his mouth. Pain exploded through his skull. But Pilecki did not cry out. He had learned long ago that showing pain only invited more violence. He took the blow, adjusted the sign between his remaining teeth, and shuffled forward. He was given wooden clogs that did not fit. He was given the blue and white striped uniform, paper thin against the cold. He was assigned number 4859. From that moment forward, he was not Tomasz Serafiński. He was not Witold Pilecki. He was a number. Numbers did not have families. Numbers did not have histories. Numbers had no value except as labor, until they could no longer work, at which point they became corpses. The capos herded them back to the parade ground. It was late at night, but the lights never went out in Auschwitz. The prisoners stood for hours. Some collapsed from exhaustion. The capos beat them where they fell. When roll call finally ended, the prisoners were assigned to labor companies and marched to barracks. Pilecki's first night in Auschwitz, he lay on a wooden bunk with 5 other prisoners sharing a space meant for one, their bodies pressed together for warmth. The barracks were unheated. It was late September, and the Polish autumn was turning cold. Outside, dogs barked. Guards patrolled. Searchlights swept across the compound. And in the darkness of that first night, Witold Pilecki began to understand the true scope of what he had walked into. This was not just a prison. This was not just a labor camp. This was a machine designed to break human beings down to nothing before killing them. This was systematic evil, operating at industrial scale. He also understood something else. If he was going to survive long enough to build a resistance network, he would have to become harder than anything Auschwitz could throw at him. He would have to endure what no human being should endure. He would have to watch horrors he could not prevent. He would have to become something between a spy, a soldier, and a ghost. That first night, prisoner 4859 made a promise to himself. He would survive. He would organize. He would get intelligence out to the world, and he would never, ever stop fighting, even if the fight killed him. Chapter 5. Building the Underground. Autumn and winter of 1940 were the worst months of Witold Pilecki's life. Not because the brutality was worse than what came later, though. It was savage beyond imagination. Not because the cold was worse, though prisoners without adequate clothing froze to death in the night, but because those first months required Pilecki to break himself down and rebuild himself as something new. He had to learn the camp's rhythms, wake at 4:30 a.m. for roll call that could last hours, stand perfectly still in formation regardless of weather. A single movement could result in a beating or execution. After roll call, meager breakfast, a thin soup that was mostly water, a piece of bread that was mostly sawdust. Then, assignment to labor commandos. Work details that lasted 12 to 14 hours. Construction, hauling stones, expanding the camp that would house millions more victims. The labor was designed to be impossible. Prisoners were worked until they dropped. Those who dropped were beaten until they rose or died. Lunch was the same watery soup. Dinner was the same. Approximately 1,300 calories per day for men doing back-breaking labor in all weather. Pilecki would later describe hunger as the hardest battle of his life. Harder than any combat. Harder than any torture. Hunger gnawed at you constantly, eroded your thoughts, turned everything into fantasies of food that would never come. Then there were the capos. These prisoner functionaries were given absolute power over regular prisoners, and most wielded that power with sadistic glee. They beat prisoners for working too slowly. They beat prisoners for working too quickly. They beat prisoners for looking at them. They beat prisoners for not looking at them. The beatings were not punishment for infractions. The beatings were the point. Terror and suffering were the atmosphere Auschwitz breathed. And the death. Constant death. Men shot for no reason. Men beaten to death for minor violations. Men who collapsed from exhaustion and never rose. Bodies were collected every morning and evening, hauled to the crematorium, burned. Early on, the single crematorium could burn 70 corpses in 24 hours. By 1943, with multiple crematoria, Auschwitz would be burning thousands per day. Into this nightmare, Witold Pilecki began his work. He observed everything. Who among the prisoners could be trusted? Who had been soldiers before? Who still had the spark of defiance in their eyes? Who was broken beyond recovery? These observations required extraordinary subtlety. Being caught organizing resistance meant torture and execution, and the Germans had informers everywhere. Prisoners who would betray others for extra rations or slightly better treatment. Pilecki identified his first recruits carefully. Fellow TAP members who had been sent to Auschwitz before him. Polish officers he recognized. Men whose character showed in how they helped fellow prisoners rather than exploiting them. One by one, carefully, quietly, he began making contact. whispered conversations during work details, coded words exchanged while standing in roll call, nods and glances that meant volumes. By October 1940, Pilecki had formed the first cell of what would become ZAL, Związek Organizacji Wojskowej, the Union of Military Organization. He structured it based on a system of fives, though the name was figurative. Small units of trusted men who operated independently and knew nothing about other units. If one cell was discovered, the investigation would be limited. The network could survive infiltration. The first five included Władysław Somacki. Others followed. Each recruit was vetted carefully, brought in slowly, tested for loyalty and discretion. The organization grew by ones and twos, never rushing, never taking unnecessary risks. Each member had a specific role. Some gathered intelligence, some acquired contraband, some maintained morale by spreading news from outside the camp. Some prepared for the possibility of eventual armed uprising. But intelligence had to get outside the camp. That was the mission's core purpose. In October 1940, just 3 weeks after his arrival, Pilecki managed to send his first report out of Auschwitz. A prisoner named Alexander Wielopolski was scheduled for release. Wielopolski memorized Pilecki's oral report. Details about camp conditions, numbers of prisoners, systematic brutality, the death toll. When Wielopolski was released, he traveled to Warsaw and delivered the report to the resistance leadership. From Warsaw, the information was forwarded to the Polish government in exile in London. In March 1941, Pilecki's first report reached the Western Allies. The British government learned about Auschwitz from a man who was still inside it, organizing resistance under the noses of his captors. More reports followed. Prisoners who escaped, released prisoners, even civilian workers who had been recruited to the cause, all became couriers carrying Pilecki's intelligence to the outside world. But survival required more than intelligence work. Pilecki had to actually survive. He worked in various commandos, field labor, construction, insulation work on the camp's crematorium, where he saw the ovens that would burn so many bodies. He contracted pneumonia. He fought through it without proper medical care. He contracted typhus. The lice-ridden hospital ward offered little actual treatment. But somehow he survived when so many others did not. He would later write that he harbored doubts, that he was overwhelmed by the mission at times. But he refused to admit it to other prisoners. Morale was fragile. If the leader showed despair, everyone would break. So Pilecki became a rock, unshakable, present, reliable. Men began looking to him for strength, and he gave it even when his own reserves ran dry. The organization grew. By early 1941, several hundred prisoners were part of ZAL's network. They operated across multiple barracks, multiple commandos. They provided mutual support, shared food when they had any, protected each other from the worst abuses when possible. They spread news from the radio. Broadcasts they occasionally heard from guards. They reminded each other that a world existed beyond these walls, that Poland still existed, that the war would not last forever. In February 1941, another resistance organization formed in Auschwitz under Lieutenant Colonel Kazimierz Rawicz. Rather than compete, Pilecki reached an agreement for cooperation. In early 1942, ZOW absorbed several other clandestine groups, including one led by Colonel Alexander Stawarz and another by Lieutenant Colonel Karol Komuniecki. The resistance was unifying under Pilecki's leadership. Then, in 1942, they accomplished something extraordinary. Over 7 months, working with smuggled parts and impossible discretion, ZOW members built a radio transmitter. A functioning radio inside Auschwitz. They broadcast from the camp throughout 1942, sending details about the number of prisoners arriving, the death toll, the conditions. They were literally transmitting from inside hell, telling the world what was happening. But in autumn 1942, they had to dismantle it. One of their members talked too much. The Germans were getting close to discovering it. Better to destroy it than have it lead to the arrest and execution of everyone involved. By late 1942, Auschwitz was changing. What had started as primarily a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners was evolving into something far worse. Soviet prisoners of war began arriving in massive numbers. The Germans used them as test subjects, experimenting with Zyklon B gas in sealed chambers. The Soviets died by the hundreds, then thousands. The Nazis were perfecting industrial murder. Then came the Jews. Trainloads. From Poland, from Hungary, from France, from Greece, from every corner of Nazi-occupied Europe. They arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the expanded complex built to accommodate the new arrivals. They were divided on the platform. Selections, the process was called. Those deemed capable of labor were marched to barracks. The old, the young, the weak, the sick, mothers with children, all were marched directly to gas chambers disguised as shower rooms. Pilecki watched the Holocaust unfold before his eyes. He saw the trains arrive. He saw the selections. He heard the screams from the gas chambers. He smelled the smoke from crematoria that burned day and night. He documented everything in reports that he smuggled out with ever-increasing desperation. His reports described the gas chambers and the crematoria in detail. He reported that by 1943, there were crematoria capable of burning 8,000 bodies per day. He described the medical experiments, the sterilizations, the torture disguised as science. He described how Jewish prisoners were worked to death, starved to death, murdered for no reason beyond their existence. And he begged the Allies to act. Bomb the railways leading to Auschwitz. Bomb the camp itself. Send paratroopers, support an uprising, do something, do anything. Over 1 million people would be murdered in Auschwitz during the war. The information was getting out. The Allies knew, but they did not act. This was perhaps the cruelest torture of all, bearing witness to systematic genocide, while the world that had been told about it chose not to believe, chose not to act, chose to prioritize other objectives, chose to look away. Pilecki had thought that information would lead to action. He learned that knowledge without will accomplishes nothing. By early 1943, the Gestapo was closing in on Zoe. Key members were identified and executed. Others were transferred to other camps. The network was fraying, and Pilecki realized that if he did not get out soon, if he did not deliver his testimony in person, everything he had witnessed, everything he had documented, everything he had suffered would die with him in this place. After 946 days in Auschwitz, Witold Pilecki made the decision to escape. Chapter 6. Flight from Death. Spring 1943. The camp was busier than ever. Transports arrived constantly. The crematoria burned around the clock. The sky carried ash. Pilecki had been transferred to a commando that worked at the camp bakery, located about 2 kilometers outside the main camp perimeter. It was a stroke of fortune, or perhaps a blessing, earned by 2.5 years of perfect operational security. Either way, the bakery offered what the main camp did not: a chance. Pilecki brought 2 trusted men into the plan. Edward Ciesielski, prisoner number 12969, a young man who had been arrested for underground activity and sent to Auschwitz in April 1941. Ciesielski had joined Zoe and proven himself reliable, brave, smart. The other was Jan Redzej, another Zoe member. Together they began planning. The bakery building had an iron door that locked from inside. During night shifts, only a single guard remained on duty. If they could get the night shift assignment, if they could overpower the guard without raising an alarm, if they could cut the telephone and alarm wires before anyone noticed, if they could get to the forest before German patrols caught them, if their timing was perfect and their luck held, they might make it. Too many ifs. But staying meant certain death. At least escape offered a chance. They acquired a duplicate key through the bakery's underground connections. They studied the guard rotations, the patrol schedules, the layout of surrounding terrain. They waited for the right night, when everything aligned. April 26th, 1943. Monday night turning to Tuesday morning. Pilecki, Ciesielski, and Redzej were assigned to the night shift at the bakery. They worked normally through the evening, giving no indication that anything unusual was planned. The guard had no reason to suspect them. They were prisoners. Prisoners did what they were told. Prisoners did not fight back. Around 2 a.m., when the work was at its heaviest and the guard's attention was on other matters. They acted. They overwhelmed the guard, tied him up, barricaded the exit from outside. They cut the telephone wires. They cut the alarm wires. And then they ran. The night swallowed them. Behind them, lights blazed at the bakery as the trapped guard tried to raise alarm. But they had minutes, maybe longer. They ran east through darkness, through fields, heading for forest cover. Shots rang out. The Germans had discovered the escape faster than hoped. Bullets snapped through the air around them. Pilecki felt the impact through his clothes as rounds passed so close they punched holes in fabric without touching skin. One bullet grazed him, a flesh wound that bled but did not slow him down. They reached the forest. Darkness and trees gave them cover. Behind them, searchlights swept the fields. Dogs began barking. German patrols mobilized. But Pilecki, Ciesielski, and Redze were moving fast, putting distance between themselves and their pursuers. They traveled through the night, avoiding roads, avoiding settlements. By dawn, they had crossed the Soa River. They found a boat by accident and used it to cross the Vistula. Each river between them and Auschwitz was a barrier the Germans would have to search. By the time morning came, they were kilometers away, exhausted but free. They spent the next several days moving cautiously through the countryside. Poland was still occupied. German patrols were everywhere, but this was different than Auschwitz. Here, there were Polish farmers who would shelter them, resistance networks that could provide safe houses, partisans who controlled areas the Germans avoided. After several days of hard travel, they reached Nowy Wiznich, near Bochnia. By coincidence, they were sheltered at a farmhouse owned by a man named Tomasz Serafiński, the very man whose identity Pilecki had borrowed for his false papers. Serafiński learned for the first time that someone had been using his name inside Auschwitz. History does not record his reaction, but one imagines it was complicated. In June 1943, at this farmhouse in Nowy Wiznich, Witold Pilecki drafted his first comprehensive report on Auschwitz. He wrote for hours, remembering everything, documenting everything. The report was buried on the property for safekeeping. It would not be revealed until after Pilecki's death, decades later. Pilecki made contact with Home Army units in the region. He explained the situation at Auschwitz. He pleaded for action. The camp could be liberated, he insisted. Zoe still had hundreds of organized prisoners inside. If outside forces attacked, if they could breach the walls, if they could create chaos, the prisoners would rise. They could take the camp from within. They could free thousands. They could stop the Holocaust, at least at this one location. The regional Home Army commanders listened. They considered, and they said no. It was too risky, they explained. Even if the initial attack succeeded, what then? They lacked the transportation to evacuate thousands of prisoners. They lacked the supplies to support them. They lacked shelter where freed inmates could hide. The Germans would respond with overwhelming force. The mission would fail, and the reprisals against the Polish civilian population would be savage. It was tactically impossible, strategically unsound, morally agonizing but operationally impossible. Pilecki was devastated. He had endured almost 3 years in hell for this moment. He had built a network. He had sent intelligence. He had prepared everything for liberation. And the answer was no. In August 1943, he traveled to Warsaw. At Home Army headquarters, he presented an even more detailed report to the command staff. He described ZOW and its members. He described his experiences. He described, in excruciating detail, the extermination of Jews and the systematic murder of thousands. His report, known as Witold's Report, or Report W, was one of the most comprehensive eyewitness accounts of the Holocaust ever compiled. The Home Army thanked him for his intelligence. They praised his courage, and they told him again that liberating Auschwitz was not feasible. General Tadeusz Komorowski considered the plan, but concluded the risks outweighed the potential success. Pilecki had to accept it. He had done everything humanly possible. He had survived the unsurvivable. He had organized the impossible. He had reported the unbelievable. And the world, even when it believed, chose not to act. The Allies saw his reports and did nothing. The Home Army saw his reports and did nothing. The Holocaust continued. Auschwitz continued. The gas chambers continued. But Witold Pilecki could not continue with Auschwitz. He rejoined the underground resistance in Warsaw. He worked with Khedive, the Home Army's sabotage and diversion unit. He coordinated with remaining ZOW members and provided what support he could to the resistance network still inside the camp. In February 1944, he was promoted to cavalry captain, with seniority backdated to November 1943. Recognition of his service, small comfort. He also joined a new organization, NIE. This was a double conspiracied entity, a resistance group within the resistance, formed to prepare for the possibility that Poland's liberation from Nazi occupation would immediately be followed by Soviet occupation. NIE stood ready to continue fighting whoever tried to enslave Poland next. Pilecki knew, as did many others, that Stalin had no intention of allowing Poland to be free and independent. The Soviets were advancing from the east, pushing the Germans back. But liberation by the Soviet Union would not be liberation. It would be exchanging one totalitarian master for another. In the spring and summer of 1944, as the Red Army approached Warsaw from the east, Polish resistance forces prepared for one final, desperate gamble. If they could liberate Warsaw themselves before the Soviets arrived, they could establish facts on the ground. The Polish government in exile in London could return. Polish sovereignty could be restored. Poland could finally be free. It was a beautiful dream. It was doomed from the start. But like so many doomed causes, men chose to fight for it anyway. Chapter 7. Warsaw Uprising. August 1st, 1944, 5 p.m. Church bells rang across Warsaw. It was the signal. The Warsaw Uprising had begun. Polish Home Army forces emerged from hiding and attacked German positions throughout the city. Tens of thousands of resistance fighters, armed with whatever weapons they had managed to acquire or steal, went to war in their own streets. Their objective was to liberate Warsaw and hold it until the Western Allies could recognize Polish sovereignty, or until the Soviet army, which had reached the eastern bank of the Vistula River and stopped there, finally advanced to help. Witold Pilecki had been ordered, as a member of NIE, not to participate. NIE's mission was post-war resistance, and its members were supposed to stay hidden, stay safe, stay ready for what came next. But Pilecki heard the church bells, he heard the gunfire. His city was fighting, and he could not stay hidden. He deliberately disobeyed orders. He volunteered for the Warszawska company of the Khedive's Chrobry II battalion. Initially, he did not reveal his rank or identity. He fought as a common soldier in the northern city center, just another Pole with a rifle, defending his homeland against occupiers. He went by the code name Captain Roman. But the uprising was chaos. In the first days, many officers were killed. Units needed leadership. Pilecki finally revealed his true identity and accepted command of the 1st Warszawska company, operating in Warsaw's Śródmieście district, the city center. On August 3rd, he led a successful assault on the railway post office. They took the building. They held it. Small victories in a war they were slowly losing. The uprising was supposed to last a few days. The assumption was that the Soviet army, so close they could see it from Warsaw's eastern districts, would advance and support the Polish fighters. Why would the Soviets let Germans massacre Poles when the Red Army could simply push forward and liberate the city? But Stalin understood the situation better than the Poles did. If the Home Army liberated Warsaw, they would demand power in post-war Poland. They were loyal to the London government in exile, not to Moscow. Stalin wanted Poland under Soviet control, governed by Polish communists loyal to Moscow. The solution was simple. Let the Germans and the Poles destroy each other. When both sides were exhausted, the Red Army would advance and take control of a city too broken to resist. So the Soviets waited across the Vistula. They watched Warsaw burn. They did nothing. The Home Army fought for 63 days. By the end, German forces had leveled much of the city. Thousands of fighters were dead. Tens of thousands of civilians were dead. Warsaw was reduced to rubble. And still, the Soviets waited. Pilecki commanded his company through the defense of a redoubt at Starinkiewicz Square. The Germans never took that position. His men held through constant bombardment, through running out of ammunition, through starvation, through watching their city destroyed around them. They held because surrender meant execution, and because even in the face of certain defeat, they would not stop fighting. On August 5, 1944, Jan Redzej was killed in action. One of the 3 men who had escaped Auschwitz with Pilecki, who had run through the night while bullets chased them, who had survived hell, died fighting for his city. Edward Ciesielski was wounded multiple times, but survived. October 2, 1944. After 63 days of fighting, the Warsaw Uprising ended in surrender. The Germans granted the Home Army combatants prisoner of war status, a recognition that they had fought as soldiers, not partisans. It was small mercy before none. The surviving fighters were marched into captivity. Pilecki was sent to Oflag 7A, a POW camp for Polish officers near Murnau in Bavaria. There, despite everything, he maintained his spirits. Younger prisoners called him Daddy because of how he looked after them, sharing what little he had, offering encouragement, maintaining discipline and hope even in captivity. He spent the winter and spring of 1945 in Murnau as the war ground toward its conclusion. The Allies closed in from west and east. Germany was collapsing. The Third Reich was dying. And on April 29, 1945, American forces liberated Oflag 7A. Witold Pilecki was free. Again. Chapter 8. The Final Mission. Freedom. The word felt strange after so long. Pilecki had been free from Auschwitz for 2 years, but free in German-occupied Poland was not really free. Now, with American soldiers surrounding the camp, with the German officers disarmed and deported, with the war in Europe days from ending, he was genuinely free for the first time since 1939. In July 1945, Pilecki made his way to Italy. The Polish Second Corps under General Władysław Anders was stationed there, part of the Allied forces that had fought through the Italian campaign. These were Polish soldiers who had continued fighting after Poland's fall, loyal to the government in exile in London. They were waiting, hoping, believing that Poland would be liberated and restored. But the world was dividing. The United States and Britain were allies with the Soviet Union. Stalin sat at the table at Yalta and Potsdam conferences as a victor, as a liberator, as a partner in the new world order. And Stalin had very clear ideas about Poland's future. Poland would have a government. It would have elections. But those elections would be controlled. That government would be loyal to Moscow. Poland would be Soviet-controlled, whether Poles liked it or not. The Polish Second Corps and the government in exile protested. The Western Allies sympathized, but did nothing. Poland had been betrayed by the Munich Agreement in 1938. Poland had been betrayed by the failure to support the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. Now Poland was being betrayed again, at the conference tables where the victors divided the spoils. In Italy, safe for the first time in years, Witold Pilecki compiled his reports. He wrote the most comprehensive version of Witold's report, over 100 pages detailing his Auschwitz experiences. He documented the atrocities. He documented the resistance. He documented everything, anticipating that he might be killed if he returned to Poland, wanting to ensure that at least the testimony survived. General Anders and his officers were preparing for the possibility that the conflict with the Soviet Union would heat up, that the Western Allies would finally realize the Soviets were not partners, but threats, that Poland would need fighters ready to continue the struggle. They needed intelligence from inside Soviet-controlled Poland. They needed to know what was happening to former Home Army members, what was happening to the Polish people, what the new communist government was doing. Someone had to go back. Someone had to gather that intelligence. Someone who knew how to operate underground, who had contacts, who could move through danger without breaking. Pilecki volunteered. Of course he volunteered. In December 1945, using identity papers from the German occupation, registered under the name Roman Jezierski, Witold Pilecki returned to Poland. He knew the risks. He knew the new government, backed by Soviet security services, was hunting former Home Army members. He knew that going back might be suicide, but his family was there. His country was there. His duty was there. He arrived in Warsaw, and began building an intelligence network. He gathered information about the communist government's crimes. He documented arrests of Home Army soldiers. He reported on Soviet exploitation of Poland's economy. He sent reports back to General Anders in Italy through couriers. The information was not military secrets. It was essentially journalism, documenting publicly visible events that the communist government tried to suppress. But to the communists, any information leaving Poland was espionage. Any former Home Army member was an enemy. Any connection to the London government in exile was treason. Pilecki worked under his false identity, changing jobs frequently. He worked as a jewelry salesman, as a bottle label painter, as night manager of a construction warehouse. He lived a shadow life, always moving, never relaxing, constantly aware that one mistake could mean arrest. He tried to meet with his family. In December 1946, he spent Christmas with Maria, Andrei, and Zofia at the apartment of Maria's sister and brother-in-law, Eleonora and Edward Ostrovsky. The children remembered that Christmas tree, decorated with red and white bows, Poland's colors. They remembered their father being there. They did not. No, it was the last Christmas they would ever have together. In July 1946, Pilecki was informed that his cover had been compromised. Polish security services knew who Roman Jezierski really was. General Anders ordered him to leave Poland immediately. But Pilecki was reluctant. He had family here. His network was functioning. He had not found a suitable replacement to continue the intelligence work, and Maria was unwilling to leave Poland with the children. Pilecki asked for the order to be rescinded. In early 1947, his superiors agreed. He could stay. He would continue his mission. It was a death sentence, but they honored his choice. On May 8, 1947, Polish secret police arrested Witold Pilecki. The Ministry of Public Security had finally caught their traitor. Chapter 9. Torture and Trial. Mokotów Prison. The same prison where he would eventually die. But first, they wanted information. They wanted names. They wanted the entire network dismantled. And they had methods. Pilecki was tortured systematically. The interrogations were supervised by Colonel Roman Rumkowski and conducted by Józef Różański, who headed the investigation bureau at the Ministry of Public Security. These were men who had learned their craft from the Soviet NKVD. They knew how to inflict pain. They knew how to break human beings. They had broken thousands before Pilecki. But Pilecki had survived Auschwitz. Physical pain, as terrible as it was, could not break someone who had endured what he had endured. He refused to reveal sensitive information. He tried to claim full responsibility for everything to protect his network. He gave them nothing they could use to arrest others. The torture continued for months. His captors were patient. They had time. They had absolute power over him. No one was coming to save him. No lawyer would defend him. No international observer would protest. This was communist Poland, and Witold Pilecki was property of the state, to be disposed of as the state saw fit. Maria brought him packages. She attended preliminary hearings when she was allowed. She wrote letters to officials, pleading for mercy. She wrote to President Boleslav Bierut, begging him to spare her husband's life. She reminded them that Pilecki had fought for Poland, that he was a war hero, that his only crime was loving his country. Her pleas went unanswered. On March 3, 1948, the show trial began at the Warsaw District Provincial Court on Nowowiejska Street. Pilecki was tried alongside 7 co-defendants: Maria Szelagowska, Tadeusz Plujanski, Szymon Jamont-Krzywicki, Maksymilian Kautsky, Jerzy Nowakowski, Witold Różicki, and Makary Sieradzki. The charges were espionage, planning assassinations of government officials, illegal possession of weapons. The trial was political theater. The prosecution was led by Major Czesław Lipinski. The defense was not permitted to present evidence or call witnesses. Pilecki himself was not allowed to testify properly. The court had one purpose: to declare him guilty and sentence him to death, as an example to anyone else who might resist communist rule. One of the witnesses against Pilecki was Józef Cyrankiewicz. He had been a prisoner in Auschwitz. He had survived. Now he was a communist politician who would later become Prime Minister of Poland. He testified against Pilecki, calling him an enemy of the state who must be treated harshly. The man who had organized resistance inside Auschwitz was betrayed by a fellow survivor who chose power over honor. The charges themselves were absurd. The weapons Pilecki allegedly possessed were arms that Home Army fighters had hidden after the Warsaw Uprising, not weapons he was stockpiling for new attacks. The assassination plots were fabrications based on failed provocations. The espionage was simply sending information to Polish military forces in Italy, information that any journalist could have gathered and reported. But truth did not matter. This was not a trial. It was a ritualized execution with paperwork. On March 15, 1948, the verdict was announced. Maria Jelagowska and Tadeusz Plujanski, death. Witold Pilecki, death. The others received various prison sentences. The Supreme Court reviewed the verdict on May 3, 1948, and confirmed it. Appeals for clemency were filed. Pilecki wrote his own letter to President Bierut. Maria wrote. The lawyer Lech Buszkowski wrote. Similar appeals were filed for Jelagowska and Plujanski. On May 20, 1948, President Bolesław Bierut made his decisions. He granted clemency to Maria Jelagowska and Tadeusz Plujanski, commuting their sentences to long-term imprisonment. For Witold Pilecki, he confirmed the death penalty. 5 days later, they would carry it out. Chapter 10. Execution. May 25, 1948, 9:30 p.m. Witold Pilecki stood facing the execution wall in Mokotów prison, the same prison where thousands would be executed over the coming decades, where Polish patriots would be branded traitors and murdered by their own countrymen, where communist terror would be institutionalized and normalized. He had spent 13 months in captivity, 13 months of torture, isolation, propaganda, systematic dehumanization. And through it all, he maintained his dignity. He had written, in one of his final letters, "I tried to live in such a way that when dying, I would rather feel happy than scared." The execution team was assembled. Deputy Prosecutor Major Chipraszewski, Prison Head Lieutenant Monko, Doctor Lieutenant Kazimierz Jezierski, Father Captain Wincenty Martuszewicz, the chaplain, and Piotr Śmietanski, the executioner. History has not recorded Pilecki's last words, if he was permitted any. The communist authorities were not interested in documenting the final statements of the men they murdered. But we know he faced death with the same courage he had shown facing everything else. In his remarkable, terrible, beautiful life, a single shot to the back of the head. The method was designed to be quick, efficient, clean. Pilecki fell. His body was removed. He was buried secretly, probably in the Powązki cemetery, in a section called L, or the Meadow, a patch of ground where the communists disposed of executed prisoners in unmarked graves. To this day, despite searches, despite excavations, despite the fall of communism and the opening of records, Witold Pilecki's body has never been found. The communist authorities moved quickly to erase him from history. His reports were confiscated and classified. His name was forbidden in schools, in books, in public memory. His family was persecuted. Maria had to take work as a cleaner at a Catholic orphanage. Andrei and Zofia were denied university admission because they were children of a traitor. They could not find decent jobs. They lived under constant surveillance, constant stigma, constant punishment for their father's crimes. The Sukocha estate, the ancestral land that had finally been restored to the Pilecki family after generations of exile, was razed to the ground by the communists. The buildings were demolished. The land was taken. It was as if the Pileckis had never existed. For over 40 years, Witold Pilecki's story was locked away in classified files, whispered about in underground circles, known to very few outside Poland. Inside Poland, if his name was mentioned at all, it was as a traitor, a spy, an enemy of the people. The man who had voluntarily entered Auschwitz, who had organized resistance inside hell, who had sent the first comprehensive reports about the Holocaust to the Allies, who had fought in the Warsaw Uprising, who had sacrificed everything for Poland, was branded as Poland's enemy by the government claiming to represent Poland. This injustice lasted until the Soviet Union collapsed. Chapter 11. Resurrection. 1989. Textiles. Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Empire crumbled. Across Eastern Europe, communist governments toppled. In Poland, solidarity had been fighting for years, and finally, the communists lost their grip. Free elections came. Democracy returned. And with democracy came the possibility of truth. In September 1990, the Supreme Court of Poland reviewed the case of Witold Pilecki. They examined the charges. They examined the trial. They examined the evidence. And they reached the only conclusion any honest court could reach. Pilecki was innocent. The charges had been fabricated. The trial had been a sham. His conviction was a travesty of justice. His execution was murder. Witold Pilecki was formally exonerated. His name was cleared. His honor was restored. And Poland, finally free, could begin learning who he had really been. The government provided Maria and the children with compensation, 50,000 zloty, equivalent to about $12,700 in current value, as reparations for the loss of support and the injustice they had suffered. It was inadequate compensation for stolen decades, but it was acknowledgement. In 1995, Pilecki was posthumously awarded the Order of Polonia Restituta. In 2006, President Lech Kaczynski awarded him the Order of the White Eagle, Poland's highest decoration. In 2013, he was posthumously promoted to the rank of colonel. Streets were named after him. Schools were named after him. Monuments were erected. His story began to spread beyond Poland. Historians started examining his reports. British historian Michael Foot had mentioned him in 1978 in Six Faces of Courage, calling Pilecki one of the 6 most courageous resistance fighters of World War II. But it was not until the 1990s and 2000s that comprehensive research became possible. Polish historian Adam Syra led the way, publishing the first major biography and reconstructing Witold's report from fragments and archives. In 2012, the Auschwitz Museum published the English translation of Pilecki's Auschwitz diary under the title The Auschwitz Volunteer, Beyond Bravery. Michael Szudrich, chief rabbi of Poland, wrote in the foreword, "When God created the human being, God had in mind that we should all be like Captain Witold Pilecki, of blessed memory." British historian Norman Davies wrote, "If there was an Allied hero who deserved to be remembered and celebrated, this was a person with few peers." In 2019, British journalist and historian Jack Fairweather published The Volunteer, the true story of the resistance hero who infiltrated Auschwitz. The book won the Costa Book Award. It brought Pilecki's story to audiences around the world who had never heard of him. Fairweather spent years researching, interviewing survivors who had known Pilecki, tracing his escape route, examining newly declassified documents. The biography revealed the depth of Pilecki's courage, the scope of his accomplishment, and the tragedy of his fate. Andrzej and Zofia Pilecki spent decades working to restore their father's reputation. They collaborated with the Institute of National Remembrance, provided family documents and photographs, gave interviews, attended commemorations. In 2017, they were granted honorary citizenship of Ostrów Mazowiecka. In 2019, monuments to Pilecki were unveiled in Warsaw. Schools and streets bear his name across Poland. The Pilecki Institute was founded to research and commemorate resistance to totalitarianism, named after a man who resisted 2 totalitarian systems and paid with his life. Maria Pilecka died on February 6, 2002, at the age of 96. She was buried in Powązki Cemetery at the Pantheon of Fighting Poland, next to a symbolic grave for her husband. Witold's body has never been found, but his memory is honored there, alongside Poland's other heroes. Today, Witold Pilecki is celebrated as one of Poland's greatest heroes. His story is taught in schools. His name is spoken with reverence. The man who was erased from history is now one of history's most compelling figures. The man branded as a traitor is recognized as one of the most selfless patriots who ever lived. Chapter 12. Legacy. What do we learn from Witold Pilecki? What does his story demand of us? First, we learn the power of witness. Pilecki could have stayed on his farm. He could have fled Poland in 1939. He could have avoided the Warsaw Roundup in 1940. He could have escaped Auschwitz earlier. He could have stayed in Italy in 1945. At every junction, he chose the harder path, the dangerous path, the path that required bearing witness to evil and fighting against it, even when fighting seemed hopeless. He voluntarily entered Auschwitz because someone needed to see what was happening there and report it to the world. He understood that evil thrives in darkness, in secrecy, in the silence of witnesses. By entering hell, by organizing resistance within it, by sending out reports that documented the Holocaust as it was happening, he ensured that the world would know. The world chose not to act on that knowledge, which is a separate tragedy. But the knowledge existed because Pilecki put himself at risk to gather it. Second, we learn that courage is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite fear. Pilecki was terrified in Auschwitz. He wrote about his doubts, his moments of being overwhelmed, his struggles with hunger and disease. But he never quit. He kept organizing. He kept resisting. He kept choosing to do what needed to be done, even when every instinct screamed for him to just survive, just get through another day, just save himself. Third, we learn that moral courage matters as much as physical courage. Pilecki could have saved himself by betraying others during his torture in Mokotów prison. He could have given his interrogators names, locations, operational details. Many would have. Many did. He refused. He protected his comrades, even when protecting them meant his own death. That is moral courage in its purest form. Fourth, we learn that totalitarianism is totalitarianism, regardless of which ideology justifies it. Pilecki fought against Nazi totalitarianism. Then he fought against communist totalitarianism. He understood that the swastika and the hammer and sickle both represented systems that crushed human dignity, that murdered dissent, that demanded absolute obedience. He understood that calling yourself a liberator does not make you one if you replace one form of slavery with another. Fifth, we learn the cost of indifference. The Western Allies received Pilecki's reports about Auschwitz. They knew about the gas chambers. They knew about the systematic extermination. And they chose not to bomb the railways, not to bomb the camp, not to divert resources to stopping the Holocaust. They had their reasons, their strategic calculations, their priorities. But the result was that over 1 million people died in Auschwitz while the world looked away. The Home Army received Pilecki's pleas to liberate the camp. They said no. They had their reasons. But the result was that prisoners who could have been freed continued suffering and dying. Indifference, even when dressed up as tactical necessity, enables evil. Sixth, we learn that truth matters. The communist government in Poland tried to erase Pilecki's story. They branded him a traitor. They murdered him. They persecuted his family. They classified his reports. They forbade his name. For 40 years, they nearly succeeded in erasing him from history. But truth has a way of surviving. His reports survived. His family's memory survived. And when freedom finally came to Poland, the truth could finally be told. Seventh, and perhaps most importantly, we learn that one person can make a difference. One person, choosing to act, can change history. Pilecki was one man. He did not have an army behind him when he entered Auschwitz. He did not have government backing or official orders or the resources of a nation. He had his courage, his conscience, and his conviction that bearing witness matters. From that starting point, he built a resistance network inside the most evil place humans have ever created. He sent out intelligence that documented the Holocaust. He saved lives through his network's mutual support, smuggling of food and medicine, protection of vulnerable prisoners. He inspired others to resist, to maintain hope, to remain human in a place designed to strip away humanity. His reports preceded the Auschwitz protocols by years. He was the first to send comprehensive intelligence about the Holocaust to the Allies. His testimony stands as one of the most important historical documents of World War II. And it exists because one man chose to walk into hell to tell the world what he saw. What would have happened if Pilecki had not volunteered? We will never know. But we do know what happened because he did. Information reached the Allies. Prisoners in Auschwitz had hope. Resistance existed where none should have been possible. And after the war, when truth was finally permitted, the world had his testimony as witness to what had happened. Epilogue. There is a photograph of Witold Pilecki, taken in Auschwitz. Prisoner number 4859. His head is shaved. His face is gaunt. His prison uniform hangs on a body wasted by starvation. But his eyes are clear, direct, unwavering. There is no defeat in those eyes. There is no surrender. There is steel. There is will. There is a soul that chose to be there and would not be broken. That photograph is haunting because we know what he endured to have it taken. We know what he would endure after. We know that the man in that photo would survive Auschwitz, fight in Warsaw, return to a country that would murder him, and die with his name erased from history for 40 years. We know all of that, and still, those eyes do not flinch. On the night of May 25, 1948, at 9:30, Witold Pilecki's body stopped. His heart ceased. His breath ended. But what he represented, what he fought for, what he died protecting, that did not end. It cannot end. It lives in every person who chooses to resist tyranny. It lives in every person who bears witness to injustice. It lives in every person who refuses to look away from evil, even when looking away would be easier. The world did not save Pilecki. The Allies did not act on his intelligence fast enough. The Home Army could not liberate Auschwitz. The Polish government murdered him. But none of that erases what he accomplished. None of that diminishes his courage. None of that makes his choice any less extraordinary. He volunteered to enter hell so that the world would know hell existed. He survived 946 days inside that hell and built a resistance network that saved lives and documented genocide. He escaped and tried to convince the world to act. When the world would not act, he kept fighting. When one totalitarianism fell, he fought the next one. And when that totalitarianism caught him, tortured him, and murdered him, he protected his comrades to the end and faced execution with dignity. His story was silenced for 40 years, but truth endures. His reports survived. His legacy survived. And now, decades after his death, Witold Pilecki is finally receiving the recognition he deserved in life, but was denied until long after death. We tell his story not just to honor him, though he deserves all honor. We tell his story because the world still has Auschwitzes, still has tyrants, still has systems that crush human dignity. We tell his story because people still face the choice between complicity and resistance, between silence and witness, between comfort and courage. We tell his story because every generation needs heroes who show what humans can endure, what they can accomplish, what they can sacrifice for the sake of what is right. Witold Pilecki was not a perfect man. He was a man who made an impossible choice and lived with the consequences. He chose to be more than he had to be. He chose to do more than anyone should have to do. He chose to bear witness when no one else could. And he paid for those choices with years of suffering and ultimately with his life. But he also gained something. He gained the knowledge in his final moments that he had done everything possible. He had not looked away. He had not chosen the easy path. He had not betrayed his comrades or his country or his conscience. He had lived, as he wrote, in such a way that when dying, I would rather feel happy than scared. His body lies in an unmarked grave somewhere in Warsaw, but his name is on monuments and streets. His story is in books and films. His reports are in archives and museums. His example stands as proof that one person's courage can echo through generations. This is not just history. This is a message to everyone who will come after. Every person who faces injustice, who sees evil, who must choose whether to act or to look away. Witold Pilecki's story says, you can act, you can resist, you can make a difference. The cost may be high, even unbearable, but the alternative is to live with having done nothing while evil triumphed. The next time you face a moment where speaking up will cost you, remember the man who volunteered for Auschwitz. The next time you witness injustice and wonder if one person can make a difference, remember prisoner 4859 organizing resistance inside hell. The next time you think about looking away because fighting seems hopeless, remember the cavalry captain who kept fighting even after 2 totalitarian regimes tried to break him. Because legends like Witold Pilecki never truly die. They live in every act of courage. They live in every refusal to submit to tyranny. They live in every person who chooses to bear witness even when the world would rather not see. If this story moved you, if you felt even a fraction of the courage this man embodied, then honor it, share it, remember it, tell others, because these are not just stories from the past. These are lessons for the present, maps for navigating a world that still produces tyrants and still requires heroes. Stand with us, like, subscribe, carry this flame forward, because somewhere, right now, the next Witold Pilecki is facing their impossible choice, and they need to know that courage matters, that witness matters, that one person's choice to resist can change everything. The story of Witold Pilecki is not over. It continues in everyone who hears it and chooses to live with even a fraction of his courage. His fight continues in everyone who refuses to look away from evil. His legacy continues in everyone who understands that freedom requires eternal vigilance, eternal courage, eternal resistance against those who would enslave and destroy. We remember Witold Pilecki not because he was superhuman, but because he was fully human. He felt fear and chose courage. He felt despair and chose hope. He faced impossible odds and chose to fight anyway. And in making those choices, he showed us what humans can be at their best. May we all find, in our own moments of trial, even a fraction of his strength. May we all choose, when the moment demands it, to be like Captain Witold Pilecki, unbreakable, undeniable, unforgettable.